On a gloomy afternoon in the quiet town of Riverside Hollow, a soldier who had just returned from the border suddenly froze when he saw a little girl collapsed on the sidewalk, her leg badly injured. He rushed to lift her up, but the words she spoke left him completely stunned. He never imagined that this little girl was actually... It was late afternoon in Riverside Hollow, the peaceful town wearing the ashen cloak of an overcast day. On the familiar gravel road, the low hum of an old engine drifted closer, steady as the heartbeat of a soldier returning from war. That soldier was Daniel Carter, a man nearing 40, his face weathered by the sun and his eyes carrying untold stories. He had just come back to the United States after many years, serving overseas without telling a soul, driving his beat-up old car slowly through the streets where he had once run and played as a boy. Every turn, every crumbling wall stirred up fragments of a past he had tried to forget, yet they pulled at him all the same. Daniel pulled over at the curb in front of a small, bustling market. He stepped out of the car and walked toward a stall selling hot cornbread, the rich, buttery aroma drifting from the freshly baked loaves. The vendor, Mrs. Helen Brooks, her hair as white as snow, looked at him with a mixture of surprise and emotion. She recognized Daniel instantly. "Daniel, you're home, my boy," she asked, her voice trembling, her eyes narrowing with joy. "Your family will be so happy to see you." Daniel accepted the warm paper bag of cornbread, his hand tightening slightly on its edge. A weary smile spread across his face. "I hope so too, Mrs. Brooks," he said quietly, his gaze sweeping over the familiar stalls, searching for a piece of the peace he had lost. In his life, everything had changed, yet these cornbread loaves seemed to have kept their same taste. Stopping here was his way of finding a little warmth from home, a familiar memory before facing whatever waited ahead. When the old car began rolling again, turning onto a quieter street whose bricks he knew by heart, Daniel suddenly slammed on the brakes. His chest tightened. Right in front of him, huddled beside an old trash bin, was a small girl, no more than 7 years old. Her face was smeared with dirt, her clothes filthy and torn. One of her legs looked injured, a red stain seeping into the fabric of her pants, her tiny hands clutching the wound, trembling. Maybe she had fallen. Or maybe something far worse had happened. Daniel didn't think. The instinct of a soldier who had seen too many battles and was used to pulling others out of danger pushed him forward. He opened the car door and almost ran. Each step was firm, his footsteps echoing in the empty street. "What happened to you? What's your name?" he asked, his voice warm but edged with concern. The little girl lifted her head. Her wide, tear-rimmed eyes stared straight at him, red from crying and fear. She hesitated, as if afraid to say her own name. "My name is Sophie Carter." Her voice was barely above a whisper, almost swallowed by the air between them. Daniel froze. It felt as if the blood in his veins stopped flowing. Carter. That name, that last name, had been etched into his mind through all the long years apart. He crouched down, his calloused hands, gently lifting her chin so he could look deeper into those eyes. Even though they were red and full of panic, there was still that familiar spark of stubbornness he knew so well. Her cheeks were gaunt, her face far too thin, but that chin, that furrow in her brow, there was no mistaking it. Every line of that small face, even in its frailty, carried traces of him and of the woman he had once loved. This was Sophie, his daughter, his own flesh and blood. His breath caught in his throat. A wave of fear rose inside him, colliding with a deep, bitter ache. "Say your name again," he murmured, his voice hoarse, almost as if he didn't trust his own ears. The girl, as though fueled by the unwavering attention of this stranger, who somehow felt so familiar, repeated a little louder, a little clearer, "Sophie, daughter of Daniel Carter." Her gaze stayed locked on his, searching for confirmation, searching for a flicker of hope. And then Daniel spoke 2 words, like an oath to himself and to the daughter he had been away from for far too long. "It's Dad." The moment those words left his mouth, every trace of fear and restraint in Sophie broke apart. She sobbed, not the cry of pain from her injury, but the cry of a child who had finally found safe harbor after being adrift for so long. She threw her arms around Daniel, her small dirty hands clinging to the worn fabric of his old army jacket. "Dad, why didn't you come sooner?" The childlike accusation was soft, but it cut into Daniel's heart like the sharpest blade. He pulled her tighter, feeling the frailty of her body trembling in his arms. He could smell the mix of sweat grime and the faint raw scent of fear clinging to her. He knew she had endured something terrible, and he, her father, had not been there. Not far away, hidden in the dim shadows of the late afternoon, Madison Blake Sophie's stepmother stood pressed against the side of a parked car at the mouth of the alley. Her face was pale, her expression frozen in fear. Her eyes were fixed on the sight of Daniel holding Sophie. She had tracked Sophie, driven her out of the house, and now she was forced to watch this moment. The web of lies she had spent years weaving was suddenly on the verge of collapsing. She can't say anything to the police. She can't see Daniel. The thoughts rushed through Madison's mind, cold and calculated. She had to act before things spun beyond her control. Her eyes glinted with a sharp, dangerous light as Daniel held his daughter close, silently vowing never to let her be alone again. The moment Daniel Carter realized that the little girl in his arms was his daughter, he held Sophie tighter, his heart feeling as if it were being squeezed. Blood was still seeping from the wound on Sophie's leg, her sobs mixing with his own heavy breathing. He didn't hesitate for a single second. With Sophie in his arms, he hurried to his old car and gently placed her in the back seat. Every movement was careful, as if he was afraid of causing her any more pain. His only purpose now was to get her to the hospital no matter what it took. The car sped down the road through Riverside Hollow, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the falling night. Daniel kept his focus on the road, but his eyes never strayed far from Sophie's reflection in the rearview mirror. About an hour later, they arrived at St. Mary's General Hospital. The hospital was loud and busy. Daniel carried Sophie straight into the emergency room. Nurses and doctors rushed to take her in and wheeled her inside. Daniel stood there powerless as the ER doors swung shut. He paced back and forth along the cold tile hallway, his heavy footsteps echoing. Every minute felt like an eternity. He wanted to do something, anything, but all he could do was wait, feeling a kind of helplessness he had never experienced, not even on the battlefield. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion and worry pressing down on him. A few moments later, a nurse, Emily Rogers, walked out holding Sophie's medical chart. She was a middle-aged woman whose eyes carried both weariness and deep experience. The break in her leg is at an angle, and there are signs of older injuries. Emily began her gaze, pausing on Daniel's face, studying him. "Are you the girl's family?" Daniel drew in a deep breath. His goal was to make his claim clear. "I'm her father," he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. Emily raised an eyebrow and looked him over from head to toe. "Do you have any documents to confirm that?" Daniel shook his head. "No, I just returned after many years, but I know her. She's my daughter." He said each word carrying an unshakable certainty. He didn't need papers to know this was his own flesh and blood. Sophie was brought out of the emergency room, her face pale, her eyes half open and unfocused, yet still searching for Daniel. She was moved into a temporary recovery room, her small legs carefully braced. Daniel stepped to the side of her bed and gently took her tiny hand in his. Her hand was ice cold and fragile. "Are you really my dad, Sophie?" whispered her voice weak, her eyes still holding a flicker of doubt as if afraid this was only a dream that would soon fade away. Daniel tightened his grip on her hand. He bent down, pressing his forehead to hers. "I am. I'm here now, Sophie. I'm here with you." "Are you going to leave again?" The question cut straight through him like a knife. She didn't need an empty promise. She needed certainty. Daniel didn't answer right away with words. He simply held her hand tighter, a vow without language. He would never turn his back on her again. That action alone carried a clear purpose to reassure her and to make a silent oath to himself. Emily pulled Daniel aside into a quiet corner of the hallway, away from passing ears. Lowering her voice, her eyes studied him closely. "Mr. Carter, I need to tell you this. I've seen this little girl a few times this year." Emily looked directly into his eyes. Every time it was because of an injury. without a clear reason. And she always came alone. Sometimes it was scrapes, sometimes bruises once it was a head wound. I've reported it to my superiors several times, but nothing ever came of it. Each word from the nurse felt like a blow to Daniel. He felt a fire of anger rise in his chest. Emily's purpose was to inform him, and she had done just that. Her words confirmed his worst fears. He took out his phone, his fingers trembling as he typed a short message to his sister, Aunt Grace. "I'm back. There's something I need to tell you. See you soon." He didn't explain the details yet, knowing she would worry. The purpose was to let her know he had returned and to make contact the first step to ensuring he wasn't alone. Daniel returned to Sophie's bedside. He stood silently, his eyes fixed on her face, and reached to wipe away the streaks of tears still clinging to her thin cheeks. The purpose of the gesture was to connect with her, to soothe not only her heart, but his own. Inside, one question echoed relentlessly. He whispered it not to Sophie, but to himself, to the universe. "Who let you end up like this?" From St. Mary's General Hospital, Daniel Carter took Sophie nowhere else but to the house she had been forced to call home during all the years he was away. He knew it was the place where she had suffered so much, but he needed to face Madison Blake directly. His purpose was clear, not only to bring his daughter to a temporarily safe place, but also to confront the woman who had caused all of this, gather evidence, and begin the journey to seek justice for Sophie. On the way back, Sophie curled up in his arms in the back seat, still weak, but no longer trembling as violently as before. She clung to him, her head burrowing into his shoulder like a frightened little bird. Every time the car drew closer to the familiar neighborhood, she shivered slightly, her steady breathing turning short and uneven. Daniel felt her fear. He gently smoothed her hair, an act meant to reassure her and perhaps to steady himself as well. When the car stopped at the gate, Madison Blake was already standing at the doorway, her face arranged to look anxious and worried. She had been waiting. As soon as Daniel stepped out of the car carrying Sophie, Madison rushed toward them, feigning shocked disbelief. "Sophie, where have you been? Where was she all night, Daniel? I called the police to look for her all day." Madison cried, her voice pitched high for dramatic effect, her eyes wet but without the slightest trace of sincerity. Her goal was to stage a perfect scene, painting herself as the devoted and distressed stepmother. Sophie, still pressed tightly against Daniel, suddenly lifted her head, her eyes full of fury, locked directly on Madison. "You told me never to come back," Sophie whispered. Her voice was weak but laced with something haunting, words like a knife cutting through Madison's false facade. Madison's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly put her heartbroken face back on. "That's because you were being rude. You ran away and wouldn't listen. I'm sorry, I was just too worried about you." She tried to cover, reaching out as if to touch Sophie, but the girl shrank away. Daniel cut off the cheap performance with a voice that was cold and firm. His purpose was to expose the truth. "Stop pretending, Madison." It was as if cold water had been thrown in her face. She stepped back, her eyes flashing with both anger and fear. "What are you talking about? I'm the one who raised her all these years while you weren't here." "You have no right to judge me," she shouted, trying to push the blame and guilt back onto him. From behind Daniel, Sophie tugged lightly at his shirt. She whispered, her voice weak, but each word clear like an accusation that could not be denied. Her purpose was to tell the truth she had kept hidden. "Dad in that house, the fridge was always locked. I could only eat stale bread. Some days there was nothing at all." Sophie's words froze the air around them. Madison stood rooted to the spot, her face pale. At that moment, the sound of soft footsteps came from across the street. Mrs. Helen Brooks, an elderly neighbor who lived directly opposite, stepped out from her front gate. She was a cautious woman who rarely involved herself in other people's affairs, but her eyes were filled with compassion as she looked at Sophie. She had witnessed many things but had never dared to speak out. Her reason for stepping forward now was to offer silent support for the little girl. "Mr. Carter," Mrs. Brooks said quietly, her gaze flicking briefly toward Madison, before turning back to Daniel with a look of regret. "I've heard that little girl crying many nights, cries that tore at my heart. But I had no proof, and I was afraid." Her words, though not a direct accusation, were a powerful confirmation of Sophie's claims. They carried the weight of a living witness, even if she could not yet bring herself to say everything. Finally, Daniel led Sophie into the house. She was allowed to sleep for the night in the living room on an old sofa. He spread a thin blanket over her, wanting her to have a safe place to rest after everything she had been through. Sophie curled up on the couch, her eyes shut tightly, but she still clung to his hand. She drifted into sleep in that rare moment of peace. Daniel sat in silence through the night, the street lamp casting a faint glow through the window and throwing long shadows across the floor. In his hand was a slip of paper with the phone number of an old friend, Chief Robert Mason, the town's police chief. He knew he could not let things go on like this. His purpose was not only to regain custody of his daughter, but also to bring the person who had harmed her into the light. He looked out the window, where a pale moon hung over the quiet sky. A question echoed in his mind, heavy like a vow. If the truth isn't spoken, does justice still mean anything? He knew the answer, and he would do whatever it took to bring the truth to light. The first light of dawn slipped through the living room window, casting a gentle glow over Sophie's thin face. She was still fast asleep, enjoying a rare, deep, and peaceful rest after so many long days living in fear. Daniel Carter sat in the chair across from her, having stayed awake all night, quietly watching his daughter. His phone was still open in his hand, the screen showing Chief Robert Mason's number, but he hadn't called yet. He needed to be certain. His purpose now was to make sure Sophie was safe and to gather more information before taking any legal action. He didn't want to frighten her any further. When Sophie stirred awake, her eyes opened wide, scanning the room in confusion. She still didn't seem to believe she was somewhere safe, no longer facing constant scolding or being denied proper meals. Her gaze settled on Daniel, and a faint spark lit in her eyes. "Dad?" Sophie's voice was weak, barely more than a whisper. Daniel smiled, the first smile he had managed since returning. "Morning, sweetheart. You're up. Are you hungry?" Sophie gave a small nod. He knew she hadn't eaten properly in a long time. His goal was to give her the feeling of being loved and cared for. Daniel stood and walked into the kitchen. This house, once the home he had shared with Sophie's mother, now felt cold and unfamiliar. He opened the refrigerator and found only a few basic items. He decided to make her a simple but nourishing breakfast chicken porridge. He lit the stove quickly, the sound of boiling water soon filling the air as the aroma of chicken and rice began to spread through the kitchen. He was a soldier, used to taking care of himself and his comrades in the harshest conditions, but cooking for his daughter was something entirely new, carrying with it a deep, indescribable emotion. His aim was to prepare a meal that not only filled her stomach, but also warmed her spirit. When the steaming bowl of porridge was placed on the table, Sophie sat there, her eyes still hesitant. She didn't dare touch the food, only staring at it as if afraid it might disappear at any moment or fearful she'd be scolded for eating. "Go ahead and eat, Sophie," Daniel said gently, scooping a full spoonful into her bowl. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Sophie shook her head slightly. "I'm not very hungry. I'm not used to it." "You don't have to be afraid here, Sophie. This is your home. And I'm not going to let anyone make you go hungry again," Daniel said firmly. He wanted her to understand this place was safe, that she had the right to eat and live like any other child. Daniel's words were like a key, unlocking the emotions Sophie had kept buried for so long. She suddenly broke down in silent sobs, the kind that tore at the heart. "Dad. Back there I had to wake up before sunrise to clean the yard. If I overslept, she'd pour water over my head." Sophie spoke in broken sentences between sobs, the horrific images clear in her eyes. "At night I could only go to bed when she allowed it. If I made any noise, she'd lock me in the dark storage room." Daniel listened to every word, each one stabbing into his heart like a knife. Anger surged inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew he had to keep his composure to protect her. Right now, his purpose was to remember every detail Sophie told him and find a way to turn it into evidence. Daniel took out his phone without a moment's hesitation. This time, he didn't call Chief Robert Mason. Instead, he dialed another number 1 he knew from his days back in Mexico, the number of Laura Mitchell, a public interest attorney. "Hello, Laura Mitchell." Daniel said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I need urgent legal advice. I want to request emergency custody of my daughter. She's being abused." He gave a brief direct account of Sophie's situation, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, only telling her what the little girl had shared and what he had seen himself. The purpose of the call was to set the legal process in motion, an important first step toward gaining full custody of Sophie. While Daniel was still on the phone, a small figure quietly stepped into the kitchen. It was Ethan Blake Madison's 9-year-old son, his face sad, and his eyes carrying a constant shadow of fear. Ethan had seen everything his mother had done to Sophie. He gently walked over to Sophie and placed a piece of paper in her hand. It was a simple pencil, drawing a woman with messy hair, an angry face, and a large key in her hand, the key to the refrigerator. It was Ethan's way of telling Sophie that he understood and shared her pain, a way of showing compassion without words. Daniel looked at the drawing and let out a heavy sigh. He knew this was an important piece of evidence. He turned to Ethan. "You've seen all of this. Don't you hate your mother?" "Ethan," Daniel asked, his tone softer now, without judgment. He understood that Ethan was also a victim caught between his mother's cruelty and Sophie's suffering. Ethan looked down at the floor, his small shoulders trembling. "I'm scared. I'm really scared of her. She yells at me whenever I do something she doesn't like. But Sophie doesn't deserve this." His voice was barely above a whisper filled with pain and helplessness. He didn't hate his mother, but he couldn't accept her cruelty either. His words revealed the truth about his own situation as well as Madison's. Daniel placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, giving it a gentle pat. He didn't say anything more, but his eyes showed understanding. He knew Ethan was also enduring a great deal and could become an important witness if things went further. Daniel's goal was to build trust with Ethan so the boy would feel safe enough to tell the truth. After dinner, Daniel sat beside Sophie and read to her from an old storybook he had found in the bookshelf. His voice was warm and steady, like a lullaby carrying her into another world far from pain and fear. Sophie lay still listening, her eyes closed, but a faint smile played on her lips. Daniel's purpose was to give her a moment of peace, a small piece of childhood that had been stolen from her. Daniel knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult. But as he watched Sophie sleeping peacefully, her smile still there, he knew every effort would be worth it. He was home, and he would never let his daughter suffer again. He would fight for her justice no matter the cost. The next morning, Daniel Carter left the house after making sure Sophie was still fast asleep in the loving care of Mrs. Helen Brooks, the kind neighbor. He had asked her to watch over Sophie while he took care of important matters. Before leaving, he gently kissed his daughter's forehead and promised he would be back soon. His goal was to go to St. Mary's General Hospital to collect Sophie's old medical records, undeniable proof of the abuse she had suffered. He knew that Sophie's words, as painful as they were, would need to be supported by official documents in order to carry weight in court. The road to the hospital felt longer than ever. With every turn of the wheels, an image of Sophie appeared in his mind. Her gaunt face, her fearful eyes, the injury on her leg. He remembered what Nurse Emily Rogers had said about Sophie coming to the hospital alone with injuries that made no sense. Anger rose in him again, but he forced himself to stay calm. He needed a clear head to get this done. When Daniel arrived at St. Mary's General Hospital, he went straight to the reception desk and requested copies of Sophie Carter's medical records. The woman behind the counter looked at him suspiciously and asked for proof of relationship. Daniel explained the urgent situation, telling her that he was Sophie's biological father and was in the process of filing for emergency custody. There was some difficulty at first, but thanks to the timely intervention of Emily Rogers, the nurse who recognized him, things became much easier. Emily led Daniel to a quiet corner of the hospital away from curious ears. The area was calmer here, with only the faint hum of medical equipment and the sound of staff footsteps passing by. She handed him a thick file. "These are copies of every time Sophie was admitted, Mr. Carter," Emily said softly, her eyes full of sorrow. I kept them separately because I had a bad feeling. You see here, one time it was a broken finger, another time a burn on her hand. None of it had a clear explanation. And the most telling thing is that she always came alone. No guardian ever accompanied her. That's not normal, and no one seemed to question it. I tried reporting it, but they always said it was just typical childhood accidents. Daniel turned to each page, his heart tightening. Every injury, every doctor's note was vivid proof of what Sophie had endured. The broken finger, the bruises in multiple places on her body, none of it could be considered normal accidents. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. Emily's purpose was to provide evidence, and she had done it quietly, but with great courage. While Daniel was going through the records, a woman with a serious expression but warm eyes stepped into the hospital waiting room. It was Rachel Owens, an experienced social worker who had been notified of Sophie's case by public attorney Laura Mitchell. Rachel had come to meet Sophie and hear her story firsthand. Her goal was to assess the situation and prepare an urgent report for Child Protective Services. Rachel found Sophie playing with a few old toys in the corner of the waiting room under Mrs. Helen Brooks's watchful care. The little girl was still shy but no longer as fearful as before. Rachel gently introduced herself and began talking to Sophie in a kind, patient tone. She asked about what had happened, about what life was like at home. Sophie, though hesitant at first, began to open up under Rachel's encouragement and the sense of safety Daniel had given her. One time, she locked me outside for 5 hours, in the rain. Sophie said, her small voice trembling, but her eyes steady. I was so cold. I thought I was going to die out there. Rachel wrote down every word Sophie said in her notebook, her own eyes turning red. She had witnessed many cases of child abuse, but each story left a scar on her heart. She could not believe a stepmother could treat a child with such cruelty. Rachel's purpose was to record Sophie's statement, precisely turning the child's pain into a solid legal record. Thank you, Sophie. I'm going to write the emergency report right now, Rachel said, her voice filled with determination. You've been very brave to share this. At that very moment, something unexpected happened that shook not only the town of Riverside Hollow, but also the online community. An anonymous resident, likely one of the neighbors who had seen Madison's cruelty, uploaded an old video clip to social media. The clip, recorded on a cell phone, was slightly blurry but clear enough to recognize the people involved. It showed Madison shoving Sophie out of the gate and locking it, ignoring the little girl's cries and pleas. The post was uploaded with the caption, "This happens every week near my house. Who will speak up? Justice for Sophie." The video spread like wildfire. Within hours, the hashtag Justice for Sophie began trending on Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms. Thousands of people shared the clip, commented, and expressed outrage. Those who had never heard Sophie's story now knew. Those who had doubted now had undeniable proof. It was a major turning point, a powerful blow against Madison. The purpose of posting the clip was to expose the truth to the public and create social pressure to force the authorities to act. Daniel, on his way home with the stack of medical records, received a flood of messages and calls from friends and relatives. He opened his phone and saw the clip. He watched it over and over, each frame cutting into him like a knife. He saw Madison's angry face and the image of his small, pitiful daughter being driven from the house. He could not believe he had missed this, that his daughter had endured it all alone for so long. Meanwhile, at Madison's house, she was sitting in front of her computer checking social media. She had been notified about the clip being leaked. When she saw the hashtag EDOC's Justice for Sophie spreading and thousands of comments condemning her, her face went pale. She could not believe her eyes. Everything was falling apart. The lies, the carefully crafted performances she had built for years, were now laid bare before the public. This can't be happening. How did this happen? Madison muttered, her hands trembling. Her goal had been to keep everything hidden, but technology and the courage of a stranger had shattered all her efforts. The truth was now out, not just to Daniel, to Rachel, but to millions of others. The fight for Sophie's justice had officially begun, not only within the family, but on a broader social stage. Daniel knew he had enough evidence and he would not delay any longer. His resolve was firm. He would take Madison to court and win back a peaceful, happy life for his daughter. After the clip of Madison Blake cruelly pushing Sophie Carter out of the house spread like wildfire on social media, and Rachel Owens, the social worker, filed an emergency report based on Sophie's testimony, along with the detailed medical records from Emily Rogers, every eye in Riverside Hollow was on that house. Public pressure mounted, forcing the authorities to act quickly. Daniel Carter, advised by attorney Laura Mitchell, formally filed a petition for temporary custody at the Riverside County Family Court. His goal was to get Sophie out of that toxic environment as soon as possible and protect her at all costs from Madison's cruelty. On the morning of the first hearing, the sky was overcast as if mirroring the tense atmosphere. Outside the courthouse, a small but angry crowd had gathered. They held up handmade signs that read, "Justice for Sophie and no more abuse." Their chants echoed across the square, creating an invisible pressure on everyone present. The crowd's purpose was to show support and demand justice, to demonstrate the power of the community. Inside the courtroom, the air was solemn and stifling. Daniel walked in with Laura Mitchell and Rachel Owens. His expression was resolute, his eyes unwavering. His reason for being there was to show the determination and steadiness of a father who would not back down. Across from them sat Madison Blake, who entered the court with a well-known private attorney. Her hair was carefully styled, and her face wore an expression of sorrow and tears. She tried to present herself in the most pitiable way possible, staging a performance crafted to deceive both the court and the public. Madison's aim was to make herself appear as the victim, to blame Sophie and Daniel, and to protect her reputation and personal interests. The hearing began. Madison Blake's attorney rose and opened with a dramatic speech highlighting his client's supposed sacrifices. "Your Honor, my client, Ms. Madison Blake, has devoted many of her best years to raising Sophie Carter. She's been a devoted stepmother, sacrificing herself to care for a child whose biological father abandoned her. Daniel Carter, this soldier, has been absent from his daughter's life for many years, and now he suddenly returns without warning, only to create chaos and slander a respectable woman." The attorney said, his voice full of theatrics, trying to paint a perfect image of Madison while tarnishing Daniel's. When it was her turn, Laura Mitchell presented the evidence they had gathered: Sophie's medical records from St. Mary's General Hospital, documenting multiple unexplained injuries, Rachel Owens' testimony about Sophie's malnutrition and mental state, and most importantly, the leaked social media clip showing Madison shoving Sophie out of the house. The attorney's purpose was to present a complete picture of the abuse, not just with words, but with solid evidence. Daniel stood up, his voice steady but heavy with weight. He looked directly at Madison, his gaze unflinching. "Ms. Madison Blake said she was the one who raised my daughter. Yes, she raised her with fear. She taught her how to live in hunger through harsh punishments and in complete isolation. I was absent, I don't deny that. But I never imagined that my daughter would have to live in a hell inside what was supposed to be her family home." Daniel said, each word cutting through Madison's pretense like a blade. "She calls herself a mother. Then, who has the right to be called family when they turn a home into a prison?" Madison, no longer able to keep her composure, shouted, "What are you talking about? That girl is disrespectful. She ran away from home. I was only trying to discipline her." Madison's lawyer immediately stepped in, asking the court not to record any emotionally charged statements. However, Madison's real nature had already begun to show through. Although the court had not yet issued a final ruling on long-term custody, based on the strong recommendation from Rachel Owens and preliminary evidence about Sophie's condition, the judge granted Daniel's request for temporary custody. The purpose was to ensure the child's safety and emotional stability while awaiting the final decision. After the hearing, when Daniel walked out of the courtroom, Sophie was sitting with Mrs. Helen Brooks. The moment she saw him, her eyes lit up. She scrambled to her feet, limping toward him, and threw her arms around him. He bent down and held her tight, feeling relief wash over him. "I don't want to go back to that house, Dad. The place where even my breathing was controlled," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with emotion and fear as she remembered. I just want to stay with you. Daniel held her tighter. You're not going back there, sweetheart. Not ever. When Madison stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with the outrage of the crowd. Shouts and jeers rang out. You should be ashamed! One neighbor yelled, her face full of anger. Child abuser! Another shouted, throwing an empty water bottle in her direction. Madison hurried into the waiting car, her face-pale eyes fixed on the angry crowd. She had once been praised as the ideal stepmother, a symbol of sacrifice. Now that image had completely collapsed. The crowd's purpose was to punish her with public shame, making her feel the disgust of society. Daniel carried Sophie toward his own car, staying away from the commotion. He saw Madison's downfall, but in his heart there was no sense of satisfaction, only a deep sadness for a child who had suffered so much, and sadness for a woman who had destroyed herself through greed and cruelty. His focus now was on helping Sophie heal, not on revenge. He settled Sophie into the back seat and buckled her in. She leaned her head against the window, exhausted, but with eyes full of hope. Daniel knew this was only the beginning of a long road ahead. The court's decision was temporary, and Madison would surely try to fight back. But for now, Sophie was safe, and that was what mattered most. His goal now was to take her to a place of true peace where she could begin to heal. After the temporary court ruling, Daniel Carter did not hesitate for a moment. He knew that the house was not a safe place for Sophie, even if Madison was no longer there. That house carried too many painful memories, too many fears etched into the fragile mind of the little girl. His goal was to take Sophie to an entirely new environment, a place where she could begin to heal and rebuild her life. He decided to take her to Carter House, the small home where his sister Aunt Grace Carter lived. The house sat in the quiet hills, far from the noise and curious eyes of the town, promising a more peaceful life. The drive to Carter House was silent. Sophie sat next to Daniel in the passenger seat, her small hand gripping his finger tightly. From time to time, she looked up at him, her eyes full of questions and a small measure of trust. Daniel felt that fragile connection, and he knew he had to do everything he could to help it grow. His purpose was to rebuild the father-daughter bond that time and war had taken away. When they arrived at Carter House, Aunt Grace was already waiting at the gate. She was an older woman with a kind face and warm eyes. She was someone Daniel had always trusted and respected. He had told her in advance about Sophie's situation, and she had prepared everything to welcome the girl. Aunt Grace's purpose was to bring Sophie the warmth of family and a sense of peace. As soon as Sophie stepped out of the car, Aunt Grace opened her arms wide and pulled her into a hug. There was no judgment, no questioning, only the warmth of affection. "Welcome home, Sophie," Aunt Grace said softly, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. She smoothed the girl's messy hair. "Here, no one locks the refrigerator. If you're hungry, you eat. If you're tired, you sleep. My girl can do anything she wants as long as it makes her happy." Sophie looked up at her, her eyes wide. She had never been received with such unconditional warmth. Aunt Grace's words, simple yet full of meaning, touched her heart. They were the complete opposite of the life she had endured with Madison. Aunt Grace's goal was to create a safe and completely loving environment for Sophie. During the first few days at Carter House, Sophie was still shy. She often startled at loud noises and always glanced toward the refrigerator door with a cautious look. At night, she still could not sleep through without waking. There were nights when Daniel woke to the sound of muffled sobs coming from Sophie's room. He would go in, sit beside her bed, and sing the old folk songs his mother used to sing to him. His goal was to comfort her and let her know that he was always there. One morning, Sophie spilled a glass of orange juice on the floor. Instinctively, she flinched, wrapped her arms around her head, and shut her eyes tightly, bracing for a scolding or some sort of punishment. Daniel, still accustomed to the discipline of the military, startled and shouted, "Sophie, what are you doing?" He froze the moment he saw her reaction. She was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. Please don't punish me." "I didn't mean to," Sophie whispered, her voice filled with fear. Daniel felt his heart clench. He knelt down, pulled her into his arms, and his own eyes grew wet. His only thought was to correct his mistake immediately and make sure Sophie never felt afraid like this again. "No, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I shouldn't have yelled like that. You don't have to be afraid anymore. This is your home. Everyone makes mistakes sometimes. I'll help you clean it up." He had just learned a valuable lesson. He was a brave soldier who had faced countless battles, but fatherhood was a completely different battlefield. He needed to learn patience to love without conditions. His goal now was to become a better father. During this time, Ethan Blake Madison's son from her previous marriage got in touch with Daniel. The boy quietly sent him a recording from his old phone. It was a clear audio clip of Madison screaming the most vicious insults at Sophie, mixed with the sound of the girl's sobs. It was undeniable evidence impossible to dispute. Ethan's intent was to give Daniel proof a brave act of standing up against his own mother. Daniel listened to the recording over and over, the anger in him rising again. But this time, he knew that anger would be turned into action. He called Ethan, his voice full of gratitude. "Ethan, you were very brave to do this," Daniel said. "I know you had to face a lot to make it happen. I'm proud of you." Ethan's voice was still young but carried much more resolve now. I don't want Sophie to suffer anymore. I don't want my mom to do wrong and not be punished. I'll testify in court if I have to." Daniel rested his hand on the boy's shoulder through the phone as if trying to pass him strength. "You're braver than many adults, Ethan." "Thank you." Daniel's purpose in saying those words was to encourage and recognize Ethan's courage, so the boy would know he wasn't alone in this fight. Life at Carter House gradually settled. Sophie began sleeping better. She got used to not having every breath and every meal monitored. She started eating more, smiling more, and sometimes even running around the house carefree, something she had never dared to do before. Aunt Grace taught her how to make traditional cornbread, and Daniel showed her how to fix simple things around the house. Every moment was a small step forward on her path to healing. Still, Daniel knew the legal battle was far from over. Ethan's recording was a crucial piece of evidence, and it would be a powerful weapon in the final hearing. He had already given it to attorney Laura Mitchell, who promised it would be used effectively. His purpose was to make sure no piece of evidence was overlooked. The incident of the video showing Madison Blake abusing Sophie Carter spreading across social media ignited a wave of outrage not only in Riverside Hollow, but across the entire country. News outlets began chasing the story, turning Sophie Carter's case into the center of public attention. The purpose of the media was to report the news, but at the same time, it created immense pressure on the authorities, forcing them to act transparently and fairly. The local TV station Channel News sent reporter Jessica Price, a sharp and determined journalist, to Riverside Hollow to dig deeper into the story. She interviewed Madison's neighbors, people who had witnessed many suspicious acts from her, but had stayed silent out of fear. Mrs. Helen Brooks, the kind-hearted neighbor, appeared on television and recounted the nights she heard Sophie crying, the times she saw the girl locked outside, and the disturbing change in Madison after Daniel Carter had been away. Their testimonies, combined with the old video showing Madison shoving Sophie out the front gate, cemented Madison's image in the public's mind as a cruel abuser. The purpose of the report was to expose the entire truth, not only what had happened, but also the frightening silence of the community. Jessica Price also came to Carter House to interview Daniel. She sat across from him in Aunt Grace Carter's warm, cozy home where Sophie was playing in the backyard. "Mr. Carter," Jessica asked, her voice serious, "the public is calling you a hero. What do you think about that?" Daniel looked out the window at Sophie, who was laughing and playing happily. His purpose in answering was not to praise himself, but to emphasize the role of a father and his deep regret. "I'm not a hero, Ms. Price," Daniel replied, his voice steady and without a hint of boasting. "I'm just a father who came back too late. The real hero is Sophie. She survived and fought every day. And the silent heroes are the ones who stood up and spoke the truth, like Nurse Emily Rogers, social worker Rachel Owens, and even Ethan Blake Madison's own son." He paused for a moment, his eyes filled with regret. "If I had come back sooner, maybe she wouldn't have had to suffer so much." Daniel's interview moved millions of hearts. The public did not just see a soldier returning home, they saw a father full of remorse, a man determined to make things right, Under the pressure of public opinion and increasingly clear evidence, Chief Robert Mason of the Riverside Hollow Police Department could no longer remain idle. He summoned Madison Blake and her attorney to the police station to confront them with the new evidence. His purpose was to gather complete statements and evidence in preparation for the official trial. In the cold, sterile interrogation room, Chief Robert Mason laid several thick files on the table, detailed medical records from the hospital statements from Sophie Carter and Rachel Owens, the audio recording of Madison Blake yelling at Sophie, provided by Ethan Blake, and photographs showing old injuries on Sophie's body. "Mrs. Blake," Chief Mason said in a steady, expressionless voice, "this evidence shows that you have severely abused Sophie Carter both physically and emotionally. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Madison sat across from him, her face pale, her hands clenched tightly together. Her attorney tried to defend her, claiming the evidence was simply a misunderstanding or that Sophie had fabricated the story. Chief Mason didn't flinch. He pressed play on the audio recording. Madison's vicious insults echoed through the room. Hearing her own voice, Madison could no longer maintain her composure. The false image she had worked so hard to project finally shattered. "She's not my daughter. I have no obligation to take care of her. I only do what's best for myself." Madison shouted, tears streaming down her face. But they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and desperation. Chief Mason stopped the recording. He looked straight at Madison, his eyes filled with disappointment. "Thank you, Madison," he said, his tone heavy with meaning. "Your statement has been recorded. This concludes the session." His intent was to get Madison to admit her guilt, even if it came out in a fit of anger. Right after the interrogation, an unexpected twist struck a crushing blow to Madison. During a deeper investigation into her finances, police uncovered a shocking truth. Her bank account had received thousands of dollars from a government assistance fund meant for children in special need. Sophie Carter had been placed by Madison on the special assistance list, and Madison had falsified documents, turning Sophie into a golden case to illegally withdraw government money. Madison's goal had been to exploit Sophie for financial gain, committing not only abuse but also large-scale fraud. This information was quickly delivered to Chief Mason and attorney Laura Mitchell. Madison's case now extended beyond child abuse to include serious financial fraud. She had not only abused Sophie physically and emotionally, but also exploited her financially. Exposing this truth was meant to ensure Madison would be held fully accountable under the law for every one of her crimes. Daniel Carter received the news of this discovery from his attorney. A cold chill ran down his spine. Madison's cruelty went far beyond anything he had imagined. She was not only devoid of compassion, but also dangerously deceitful. However, the revelation only strengthened his resolve. He knew justice was now very close. That evening, Daniel sat beside Sophie, reading her a fairy tale. She leaned into him, fully trusting. He looked at her innocent face and silently vowed that no one would ever have the right to take away a child's smile again. He would make sure Madison paid for everything she had done. On the day of the final hearing to determine custody of Sophie and the child abuse charges against Madison Blake, the atmosphere at the Riverside County Family Court was more tense than ever. National media attention and public pressure had turned this case into more than just a personal dispute. It had become a symbol of the fight against child abuse. The purpose of the hearing was to bring justice to Sophie and to set a strong legal precedent. Daniel Carter walked into the courtroom holding Sophie's hand tightly. She wore a clean dress, her hair neatly braided by Aunt Grace, and though she was still a bit shy, her eyes were far more determined than before. Daniel looked at his daughter, the source of his strength. He knew that for her, he would fight to the very end. His purpose was to protect his daughter at all costs. On the opposite side, Madison Blake sat with her attorney. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. The false confidence she once had was gone, replaced by fear and despair. Madison's only goal now was to try to lessen her sentence, but she knew she was standing at the edge of a cliff. The hearing began. Attorney Laura Mitchell Daniels' legal aid presented all the evidence they had gathered in a systematic and persuasive way, detailed medical records from nurse Emily Rogers' testimony from social worker Rachel Owens about Sophie's physical and emotional condition, a recording of Madison yelling insults at Sophie provided by Ethan Blake, and most damning of all, proof of Madison's welfare fraud. The attorney's goal was to paint a full picture of Madison's cruelty and Sophie's suffering. The witnesses were called one by one: Emily Rogers, social worker Rachel Owens, neighbor Mrs. Helen Brooks, and finally Ethan Blake. When Ethan stepped up to the witness stand, the entire courtroom went silent. The boy, looking both sad and brave, recounted everything he had seen the times his mother starved. Sophie locked her in a dark storage room and punished her harshly and cruelly. His testimony was a heavy blow to Madison, who never imagined her own son would stand against her. Ethan's purpose was to speak the truth, unable to bear the injustice any longer. Finally, Sophie Carter was also called to testify. She spoke about the hell she had lived through under Madison Blake's hands in a voice that was weak but haunting. Every word she uttered felt like a needle piercing the conscience of everyone in the courtroom. Sophie's purpose was to tell her story, to let everyone know exactly what she had endured. The court recessed for deliberation. When the judge returned, his eyes were stern as he looked directly at Madison Blake. After reviewing all of the evidence and testimony, the court finds Madison Blake guilty of child abuse and welfare fraud. The judge announced, his voice echoing through the courtroom. The court sentences Madison Blake to 3 years in prison for child abuse and welfare fraud. In addition, she will be required to pay damages to Sophie Carter as provided by law. Immediately, Madison Blake collapsed into her chair, her eyes empty. The last layer of her false image had completely crumbled. She would have to pay the price for her actions. The purpose of the sentence was to punish Madison and to deter others from similar crimes. The judge then turned to Daniel Carter. The court hereby grants full legal custody of Sophie Carter to Daniel Carter. From this moment on, Sophie will live under the care and protection of her biological father. Daniel squeezed Sophie's hand tightly, his eyes glistening with tears. Justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, as Daniel carried Sophie out, the crowd erupted in applause. Tears of joy streamed down their faces. They had waited for this moment, the moment justice was done. Aunt Grace wrapped her arms around Sophie, smiling through her tears. "From now on, you don't have to ask anyone's permission to smile, my little niece," she whispered lovingly. Aunt Grace's purpose was to give Sophie freedom and joy. Ethan Blake, after witnessing it all, made an important decision. He chose to move in with his biological father, who had divorced Madison long ago and lived in another town. Ethan no longer wanted to live in the shadow of his mother. He needed a different environment, a chance to start over. His purpose was to escape his painful past and find a more peaceful life. A few months after the trial life at Carter House, the small, peaceful home in the hills had truly become a real home for Daniel and Sophie. Every morning, Sophie woke up with a smile on her face. She no longer startled at small noises, no longer looked at the refrigerator with fear in her eyes. She ate warm, homemade meals cooked by Aunt Grace or Daniel without needing permission and without worrying about going hungry. Sophie had started going back to the local school. At first, she was still shy with her classmates, but little by little, her bright laughter began to ring out across the schoolyard. Going to school was meant to help Sophie reintegrate into the normal life of a child. Daniel, a soldier, long accustomed to the harshness of the battlefield, was now learning how to be a true father. He was learning to patiently listen to Sophie's rambling stories, to play games he had never known before, and to make hot chocolate in the special way Sophie had taught him. His goal was to make up for the years he had lost and to become a complete father. One day, an unexpected visitor came to Carter House. It was Colonel William Harper, Daniel's former commanding officer in the Army. He was a stern man with a kind heart. Colonel Harper had not only come to see Daniel, but he also brought a brand new set of donated toys for Sophie. He had heard about the little girl's story from Daniel and from news reports. His purpose was to visit his old comrade and to show his concern for Sophie. During their conversation, Colonel Harper invited Daniel to take part in a new community project. "Daniel, I'm planning to open a community center called Blue Ridge Community Center in this area. It will be a home for children in difficult circumstances, children who need protection and healing. I need a manager with real dedication, someone who has been through it and understands the pain these children carry." Colonel Harper said, looking Daniel straight in the eye. "Would you be interested?" Daniel glanced at Sophie, who was playing happily with her new toys, then looked back at Colonel Harper. He knew this was an opportunity not only to make up for Sophie, but also to help other children. Colonel Harper's goal was to create a safe refuge and to invite Daniel to use his experience and compassion there. Later that afternoon, as the sunset painted the sky deep red, Daniel and Sophie sat together on the front steps of the porch. Sophie placed her small hand over the battlefield scar on the left side of Daniel's chest. It was a large scar, a reminder of the battles he had fought and the sacrifices he had made. "Dad, I'm safe now, right?" Sophie asked softly, her clear voice carrying a faint trace of worry, as if she still feared this peace might disappear. Daniel held his daughter tightly in his arms, the warmth of his body wrapping around her. He took a deep breath, taking in the scent of her hair, the earth and the wildflowers from the surrounding hills. "Daddy's home, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice deep, warm, and full of love and determination. "And no one will ever hurt you again. Not ever." His words were meant to give her absolute reassurance, wiping away any fear still lingering in Sophie's heart. That night, Daniel wrote in his journal under the dim glow of a small oil lamp. Every stroke of his pen carried the weight of his thoughts. "I once thought the battlefield was the harshest place of all, where life and death were decided by gunfire. But sometimes I've come to realize the silence inside a home can kill a child's spirit. It destroys more than bombs ever could. Today, I won not with a weapon, but with love. I've learned that being a father is not just about bringing a child into the world. It's about coming back at the right moment, standing up and protecting them when the world turns away. This has been the greatest battle of my life, and I have won. Justice has spoken, and the children who were once forgotten have been given back their laughter, their love, and a real home." And that is the story of Daniel Carter and Sophie, a story that has touched the hearts of millions. From that fateful moment by the trash bin, a father returned to save his daughter from the hell of abuse and loneliness. We have witnessed their challenging journey together, from the truth being exposed to justice finally being served. The message this story brings is deep and meaningful, isn't it? Evil will always be punished, just as Madison had to face the consequences of her cruelty and greed. Meanwhile, kind-hearted and brave people like Daniel and Grace, and even young Ethan, have received the reward they deserve. Sophie, once a frightened little girl, has now regained her smile, her love, and a true home. So after hearing this moving story, what has stayed with you the most? Do you feel a spark of hope, a renewed belief in justice and compassion? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And more importantly, in your everyday life, are you facing challenges of your own? Always remember, no matter how hard things get, there is always light at the end of the tunnel, and there will always be good people ready to help. Don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful stories. Thank you for always being with us.